Judah, he took his son Perez, who took his son Hezron, and Jacob was still alive, so 4 generations went down into the land of Egypt. So when Joseph was there, they went down into this prosperous land. And when we follow the journey of those different descendants that are clustered together in that same scripture, we find that there's a time of prosperity for God's people, the Israelites, in the land of Egypt itself. Remember, they were placed into the land of Goshen, which is up on the Nile Delta on the eastern side, and Joseph was in the city of On, which was a separate location a bit further down the Nile. So we'll just make it clear that Joseph, in his role, ruling, was not living in the same place as his family were. One of the reasons that he wasn't living there was because he was ruling, and the people were shepherds, and the shepherds were
less than the Egyptians,
detestable to the Egyptians. So Joseph coached his brother Judah and said, when you go before the Pharaoh, tell him that you're shepherds, and the Pharaoh will say, well, you're basically detestable, so I'll give you the best of the land, but I'll be over there, away from us. And so Joseph knew that this would happen, and he engineered this situation, obviously with God's hand on it, that his people would end up in the best of the land. And it tells us that they prospered, they multiplied. So last week, we basically came to the end of the book of Genesis, if you don't realise. Okay? So at that point in time, we shift the end of the book of Genesis is in alignment with the end of the genealogy of Jesus in verse 3. The first descendant was born in the land of Egypt, and that descendant was called Ram. So we also had a look at Ram as well. So his son is a nice easy name to remember, and it's called Amminadab. Okay, so this week we're going to have a look at Amminadab. The story of Amminadab, if we say that enough times I'll get it without tripping over it. The story of Amminadab is intertwined with Moses and Aaron. And you find that through marriage that these families again connect. And so we know that they lived at the same period of time. This is what the blessing of genealogy in the Bible gives us. It allows us to work this out. So going to Exodus, the book of Exodus chapter 1, the first scripture I've written here is from verses 6 to 7, and it says, Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. Okay, so we open up the book of Exodus and we find that all of those people, all of the patriarchs, all of the generations that went down, they are no longer at this point in time. We also had a look at the pharaohs last week, and you understand that we have several changes of pharaohs. So suddenly we find ourselves in new territory. The generations who were brought down by Joseph and protected by Joseph as part of God's plan were no longer. The pharaohs who actually knew them were also no longer. So we have this growing nation of people in the land of Egypt with pharaohs who are no longer in direct relationship with anyone. Right? Joseph was the connecting point between the Israelites and the pharaohs, but now that's been removed. So we find ourselves several generations later. Now remember when I spoke about what happened, Joseph basically designed all of the way that the payments for the grain during the period of famine would happen, that all of the people of Egypt would not only pay whatever money they had, but they in fact had to give everything they had, and they ended up giving their land as well. So the young Pharaoh who ruled at the time ended up becoming extremely wealthy because he owned all the land, all the food, had all of the money. He had people coming from other foreign nations bringing whatever they had to buy as well. So by the time the famine had finished, Joseph had made the Egyptian Pharaoh the most powerful person on earth. And so he had a lot to thank Joseph for. And so he blessed Joseph's family with this wonderful land. We can look at that in terms of in the natural, if you will. Obviously God's hand was on this situation. This all was spawned from the very first dream that the Pharaoh had that had to be interpreted. And of course Joseph's visions placed him in the land where the vision talks about the grain and that his family would bow down before him, etc., etc. So we see the fulfilment of those covenants. So this period of time we're in now, all of that's past. So beginning of Exodus, no more Joseph, no more of those patriarchal descendants that we got to know. So we move into a period of shift time. It goes on to say in this scripture, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. So you can get the picture of that. They were everywhere. When we talk about the land though, we're not talking about Egypt. Remember, they were in the land of Goshen, so within the particular region, okay? But obviously they were prosperous. They had their livestock, they had water, they had grazing, and they had Joseph who was taking care of them as well. And so they prospered where the Egyptian people had everything taken away from them. So you can imagine the latter generation of Egyptians would be seeing these Hebrew people as they still knew them in Egypt, and they would be resenting them because they're from outside and they're doing well and they live there and they're all in abject poverty. So this is the basis for the beginning of the story of Exodus. So Amminadab is born in Egypt, the son of Ram, as I mentioned, in an era when irreversible change came upon the lives of all Israelites. I'll just mention that before Joseph died, he did talk about how God would come to their aid at some future point in time. When we talk about that, it tells you that something's going to go wrong. If he's going to come to their aid, that means something's going to happen to them which is not good. And so we walk into this right now. Successive pharaohs had ascended the throne, and not only was Joseph's legacy forgotten, but the Egyptians came to resent and fear the prosperity of the Israelites. One of the things that the Egyptians did in history was when they took over the rule of a previous pharaoh, they would go around removing most of their history. Right? They would literally deface buildings. They would chisel off their faces, right, to remove them because they were now the ruler, they were the most powerful, and so they would change recorded history of those who came before them. You may remember, we'll talk about it in a moment, but there was actually a female pharaoh. And so we've got an even newer issue there where they'd never had a female pharaoh before. Right? She was pharaoh because her son was too young, so she was a regent pharaoh, but she nonetheless ruled. And so there's a resentment that came after that. So the pharaoh put them into slavery and had their newborn sons thrown into the Nile River. But one is set aside by God, and of course he's a baby called Moses, who is protected and raised as a prince of Egypt. Despite this opposition, Amminadab fathers a son called Nahshon and a daughter called Elisheba, a girl who would grow to be the wife of Aaron, the brother of Moses. So we find that Amminadab is going to become related to Moses and Aaron directly through this marriage. So we know from the genealogy that they were living at the same time. This is how one of the ways we can do that. And we also learn here, because it's significant, that he fathers a son called Nahshon. Why is it significant? Because the Pharaoh was killing all of the firstborn. So the story of Moses tells us that they hid Moses in the reeds, which we'll go into. But here we find that Nahshon, the next descendant in the genealogy of Jesus, the forefather of Jesus, he survived too. But his story isn't a story in itself like Moses. Okay, so once again in the Bible we have multiple things going on, but we don't always see them because we're focusing on the main story. So Amminadab, who was this next descendant in the genealogy of Jesus, he doesn't have an independent story in that sense. So we look at the genealogy of Jesus, as I mentioned, the descendants are clustered into historical eras, and we find that the three descendants born in Egypt all come out of Matthew 1:4. And it says Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon. So all of those that were in captivity when everything went pear-shaped are in that same genealogical verse. So by the time of Amminadab's birth, his great-great-grandfather Judah, we've already mentioned this, he had passed away. His great-grandfather Perez and his grandfather Hezron, they were all gone. So Amminadab was born just before the end of the reign of the pharaohs, which I was mentioning last week, and this particular pharaoh is called Amenhotep II. The pharaoh had big shoes to fill, for his father had left quite a big legacy behind. Pharaoh Amenhotep II was born and raised in the northern city of Memphis instead of the traditional capital in Thebes. When a new pharaoh came along, he built a new city with his own temples, and so they were quite egotistical. You know, they obviously wanted to show that they were greater and more powerful, so they would literally move their place of rule from one location to another location. And this shows into the story of the Bible, as you'll see. As he grew up, he oversaw wood being delivered to the dockyard in Memphis, and he was made a setim, which is a high priest in Lower Egypt. So history tells us this about this pharaoh. He maintained the kingdom that his father passed to him, and there wasn't much war happening at this particular point in time. There was also a legacy of building projects, and they were focused on temples throughout Egypt. So this is one of the periods in their history where lots of temple building was going on, which was an abundant practice there. So for their expanding nation of Israel, the reign of this pharaoh had a worrying aspect to it. He said that by the time Amminadab was born, he was known in his latter years to be utterly contemptuous of all non-Egyptians. So this is the pharaoh Amenhotep II. He's historically recorded as being contemptuous of all people who are non-Egyptian. The Bible tells us that they were growing, and there was people who were numerous, and the land was filled with them. So you can imagine this pharaoh wouldn't have been quite happy about it. He did, however, go about the female pharaoh I mentioned last week, Pharaoh Hatshepsut's name. She was removed from all of the monuments, and her image was destroyed throughout Egypt. And so obviously he had a problem with anybody who had power before him. In this particular instance, it happened to be a female. So I'm going to pass you a picture around, the first one for tonight. And this picture is actually a signet ring again. So this signet ring is actually the signet ring of this particular pharaoh, Amenhotep II. And you'll notice on there, he has a nice war club in his hand, and he's about to kill somebody. So this tells you about the character of this particular pharaoh. So this is his actual signet ring. Okay, so the characters that go with that define who he actually is. So when we say in history he didn't like non-Egyptian people, he was literally going about clubbing and killing them. So you can imagine if I was a Hebrew person living in that time, you would have some fear, wouldn't you? You'd be starting to be very worried about the fact that what's going to happen to us. So he had a son, and he was called Thutmose IV. And this is where we start. I'm going to take you into tying the Pharaoh to Moses himself and the reason for Moses' name. So Thutmose IV was his son, and he ascended the throne in 1596 BC. If you look at biblical dating for Moses, you'll find that they vary a bit, of course, but they sit in around this same time. Okay, so there's an alignment there with these two. And due to his father's illness, it is thought he ascended the throne as a child and had the help of a regent until he came of age. So we learn that this Pharaoh, as we've talked about, who are often sick, he was sick young, and so his son was put into co-rule as they normally did. So they start grooming the next generation to rule, and so they would do this with them. So his reign was quite peaceful apparently, and significantly longer than most, and was unprecedented in Egypt for artistic magnificence. So there was lots of building going on. But it was also during his reign that the prosperity and multiplication of the Israelites became a concern, and as it says in verse 7, for the land was filled with them. Now the Bible at this point in time kicks into alignment here in Exodus chapter 1 verses 8 to 10. It announces that there is a new king. So I've just said here that we've changed from one Pharaoh to another Pharaoh. The Bible says that a new king who did not know about Joseph, so this is me telling you about this generational change, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So he's painting a picture that they're a threat and they won't align with them even though they were living in their country. So he's priming his population to change. So again, as I do each week, and these will all be put up on the YouTube videos, and they just give you an idea of what the place looked like, how they dressed, and bring the story to life. So the Bible goes on to read in verses 11 to 14, it says, "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labour, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for the Pharaoh." So you might remember the previous week I said that Ramses didn't exist. It was called Avarice. And so here in the Bible we find that these new cities are about to be built. It says, "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labour in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labour, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly." So we get this picture that this Pharaoh is determined to crush these people. And so this next picture that I have here is a picture that's been done by an artist's impression. Again, we'll post these, and this is a picture of the building of Ramses. So you can see this extraordinary building structure, and of course there's remnants of all of these buildings that exist today, so there's nothing unusual about them. But what it does depict is it shows the Israelites in the foreground there being submitted to slavery. So in this particular picture they're showing them dragging this lion, which has been part of the construction. And so you can also see from the pictures the ornate nature of the ancient Egyptian buildings. You know, when they make discoveries and they're inside today, often you'll see the beautiful colouring, etc. So in those days they would have been all coloured on the outside. So they were quite magnificent, if you will. But what you have to understand is that those buildings were being built by the Israelites of the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay, so they are part of Egyptian history. The Bible tells us clearly that they were building Pithom and Ramses. Now, if you look at the map where Pithom and Ramses is, it's smack in the centre of the land of Goshen. Okay, so that means that the Israelites hadn't moved, they didn't go anywhere else. The land was full in the area that they were given, and so they were still in that land. And the pharaohs at that particular point in time, as I keep mentioning with the pharaohs, they would build new cities all the time when they took over the power, and so they were now building in this particular region. So the region that had been given to the Israelites, suddenly the pharaohs are moving in and building their capital city in that region, and they're oppressing them in slavery. So you can see there's a significant shift in what's happened, because in the past, of course, the Bible tells us that the pharaohs sent them to the land of Goshen because they were detestable and they couldn't be in the presence of the pharaoh. But now there's so many of them, the pharaoh's going in there saying, we've got to do something about them and get rid of them. So they're actually going to move in and literally build their capital on the land that was given to them and take over the land to take it back again. So this is the geopolitical situation that the Israelites found themselves in. Now remember that Joseph said that God at some point in time will come to their aid. So he prophesied that this was going to happen before he died. We can miss that in the Bible. But Joseph told them that there was going to be something that would happen that would cause them to have these problems. And of course, here we find that's the case. So at this point in time, I did mention this last week as well, pyramid building had already finished in the land of Egypt, and they were building these store cities for the Pharaoh and his family. And at this point in time as well, we're introduced to something else which is new, and we find that this particular Pharaoh built Pithom. This is the second city, and the city of Pithom was built along Wadi Chumalat near the canal. So what I'm telling you now is that when you look at the map of Egypt and you look at the delta that's at the top and you look at the Suez Canal today that connects the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, that was the north-south canal, if you will. Not exactly, but it was roughly down that line. But there was another canal back then. And it went from where Lake Timsah is today, and it went the other direction. It went east-west. And what it did is it connected the Mediterranean down and across. It didn't go all the way through to the Red Sea in those days, but it went down and across and joined to the River Nile. Why? Because the delta used to silt up all the time. So delta. They couldn't get the shipping through. They couldn't trade through the delta. These things would oxbow, as they call it, so they'd change direction, silt up. And many of the ancient Egyptian cities today, they're all gone because this moving river would constantly wipe out all of these ancient cities. So one of those cities was Ramses, built on the side of the Nile Delta. The other one was built at Pithom along the canal. So what I'm introducing here historically is that there was a canal system that joined the Mediterranean to the Nile to the major cities that went down south from them. If you look at a photo from NASA today, a satellite imagery, you'll see there's a green belt that represents where the canal used to be, that goes from the Suez Canal today across to the River Nile. It's still there, and yet it's all barren desert in between, like a triangle. So when we come to the part when they escape the Egyptians, I'm going to talk about, there's a lot of theories about where they escaped, how they got across the Red Sea, where it was, how long it took. The Bible gives us all the answers, and this is that first talk about the fact that there was actually canals there which actually formed a right angle. So if you understand, that means they can't just get out from that direction. So throwing a bit of history, a bit of pharaohs, a bit of canals, a bit of maps, geography. But in order to understand what's going on, it's necessary for us to have this information. It helps us to visualise what's going on. The Bible's talking about these places. We can read the Bible and come up with many, many place names, but not truly understand where they are. And they're significant because the events that happen in the Bible often tells us in the natural, it took so many days to walk here, it took so many days to do this, it was such and such a distance there, it was a city there, it was in the hill country, it was on the plains. It gives us all this descriptive information because it's in the natural, it's here in the world. So it actually helps us to understand about these places. So if we begin to place these things onto maps and have pictures, it brings to life what was going on in the past so we can better understand the context today. Okay, so the understanding from all of this is that with the change of Pharaoh, the Israelites were no longer free. Amminadab was amongst those descendants prophesied by the Lord to Abraham when he made his covenant with him. In Genesis 15:13, it says, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. Okay. Now there's a lot of arguing about the 400 years too, but when you read the Bible, a lot of these dates, you can't take them literally because it's not necessarily just the time that they were actually enslaved in the land itself. It talks about that they were away from their own land. Okay? So that time from when they left their land to when they went into Egypt to when they went into Mount Sinai, 40 years back up to the land of Canaan, that is all part of the exile from their land. So when we do dating, we have to have a bit more of an open mind and understand this, because if we actually just look at the time that they were in Egypt itself, we can jump in with many people around the world who have written many books and done many documentaries and disagree and say the Bible's not true. There's an error, they've made a mistake. But if you actually track the history and you read the words carefully, you'll find that the context is often wrong, and you find that the answers are actually true. For me, I always take the premise that the Bible is truth, and then we go and seek why we have these variations that are on there. So, okay. So Amminadab's generation, as it says, they increased constantly. They spread further throughout Goshen, even though they were oppressed by the Egyptians, fearing the Israelite prosperity despite making their life miserable. The Pharaoh, and this is where we move into the next part of the story, in Exodus chapter 1 still, but verses 15 to 16, he said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, let her live. Okay? So we find that they're ramping it up a notch. Right? They don't want any boys being born. Why? No boys, no kids. You don't need to eliminate both male and female to stop childbirth from happening in the future. You only need to eliminate one of the two sexes. Of course, they want to eliminate the males because the males notoriously, when they were 20 years old, were men, and men could form an army and fight. Women didn't fight in those days. So, clearly the Pharaoh wants to take out all of the future men. So he instructs this to happen. In verse 17, however, the midwives, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Interesting, isn't it? They feared God. So God's hand was still on this situation. These people knew who God was. Now the story talks about Moses, right, being hidden. But I just said that Nahshon was the firstborn of Amminadab, and he survived. Here we find, when we read the scripture, suddenly they're saying, no, we don't kill all the boys because they're born too fast. So the Pharaoh steps it up a notch, and he says, okay, he wants them to be taken. Right? In other words, don't just stop the birds, now we're going to take the boys and actually kill them. So we would assume from this, if we're looking at dating, that Amminadab was already born. He was already around, and Nahshon was already born before the story of Moses, so he would be a little bit older. So when questioned, they told the Pharaoh that Hebrew women gave birth more easily than Egyptian women. In verse 19 it says they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Okay, so they're making excuses for why they cannot stop this from happening. So the Pharaoh then commanded that every newborn Hebrew boy was to be taken and thrown in the Nile River. Okay, so he's stepping it up. So every excuse that comes his way, he steps it up another notch and tries to challenge them. This, of course, leads us into the time of Moses. This is the point in the Bible where the story of Moses begins. So Moses is the great-grandson of Judah's brother Levi. Okay, so he's a third-generation descendant in Egypt. So in Exodus chapter 2 now, verse 1 to 2, it says, now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. In Exodus, I'm moving about it because we're sort of aligning the different components, because this is from genealogy. Exodus 6:20 says, Amram married his father's sister Jochebed, so it gives the names of the people, who bore him Aaron and Moses. So we get all of the names there. So Moses was born in the year 1571. So by this time the infant Pharaoh Amenhotep III had reached the age of 17 and was able to rule Egypt without the need for a regent. Amminadab was now an adult whose life was not personally under threat from the order of the young Pharaoh, so because he's already born. As I mentioned, Nahshon obviously had to survive this period of time, the next descendant. So in the Bible we continue, Jochebed hid him for 3 months when she saw he was fine until she could hide him no longer. In Exodus 2:3 it says she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. But the Hebrew baby in the basket was not left alone, for he had an elder sister named Miriam, from verse 20, who kept watch from a distance to see what happened. So it's interesting, isn't it? So the history and the Bible aligns itself with each other, and we see God's hand on all of these incidents that are actually happening. So we have this situation again akin to Joseph, where Joseph was sent first in order to prepare the way to take care of his people. And here we have the story of the Bible once again now going to Moses, and his story is going to be that he's going to be the person who's going to lead his people back out of there. So we find this next stage happening in the history. So the Pharaoh that we're talking about, here he is. I have this extraordinary picture that I was able to find. Now this is actually a wooden carving of the Pharaoh. He's in his war bonnet. But the Pharaoh picture, it's so real, you can really see what he looked like. This is Pharaoh Amenhotep III. So you can see he's young. Right? It says he was 17-year-old at this point in time. You can see he's young. The features on the picture are extraordinary and very, very clear. So have a look at that as I pass it around. So when the fear of Pharaoh Amenhotep III rose to such a level that he ordered all of the newborn Hebrew boys to be drowned, God prepared a deliverer for their salvation. Jochebed saw her son was fine, he was good. This meant he was no ordinary child, but one born to divine favour. If we flip to the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, it says, "By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." Okay? So in other words, they understood what was going on, but they believed in God in such a way that they believed they didn't need to actually worry. And so for 3 months they kept this child, believing that he would not be taken from them. So once again, the New Testament helps us to understand what happened in the Old. So Amminadab and Jochebed had faith in God's promise, a promise that Israel should be preserved. Obviously the whole story of Moses is that he's going to be the one that leads them out of the land of Egypt. So they had to believe that there was a way out. Remember, Joseph said that God would come to your aid. Moses is that person. So they relied on God's promise so much they overcame the fear of man and trusted their obedience was their duty. They left control of the events that surrounded them to God. So I find that a really extraordinary statement. So how would we go? We have a Pharaoh, we have a king, and he says that he's going to take our first child and he's going to kill them. So what would your natural response be? You would fear. First thing would be fear, wouldn't it? Your faith would be horribly challenged because you would believe they would come knocking on your door, they'd go looking for your child, there would be birth records, they knew that you were born. It says here that the midwives were Egyptian for the Hebrew women. So there's obviously understanding that there's a relationship between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. They weren't completely isolated anymore. The Pharaoh is building his new residences amongst them. So suddenly everything had actually shifted, and so they would have this fear that their child would be taken from them. So if you were put in the same situation, your fear would often become such a big, palpable thing that you may lose sight of whom God is. But the Bible tells us that these particular parents did not fear. So it's quite extraordinary. Okay. So at this time, the daughter of the Pharaoh, as the story continues, had gone down to the Nile River to bathe while her attendants walked along the bank next to her. When she noticed the basket stuck among the reeds, she sent one of her slave girls to fetch it. So remember the story about the parents. They said that they held onto the baby for 3 months without fear, and then they obviously realised this is the issue, the baby was getting too big. Right? Life circumstances means that someone was going to see the child, hear the child, something was going to happen where they could no longer keep the baby hidden. So when she noticed the basket stuck among the reeds, she sent one of her slave girls to fetch it. When she opened the basket, she found the baby who was crying, and she felt sorry for him. And in Exodus 2:6 she said, "This is one of the Hebrew babies." So my question to you is, how does she know it was a Hebrew baby? Oh. Okay. So in Genesis 17:9-12, God said to Abraham, "This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. The covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised." So if this child was withheld for 3 months, then there would be circumcised. She would be able to look at the child and see that this child was a Hebrew child. Why? Because it was a distinguishing mark that was only applicable to God's chosen people. No one else circumcised. And so there's that connection of understanding why it was actually a Hebrew boy. So because we can follow these pharaohs through history as I have, the pharaohs, when you look at the pharaohs, they have all of their own recorded information as well. And there was actually this particular pharaoh only had one daughter, Pharaoh Amenhotep III, and her name was actually called Sitamun. Sitamun. The rest of them were all boys. So he had one daughter. So it's true this pharaoh had a daughter. Miriam, unknown as the baby's sister, approached the pharaoh's daughter. And in Exodus we're reading now from chapter 2 verses 7-10. "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." Pretty good deal. Here's your child. You've been hiding it by faith. You pop it out. They find the baby. They say, "We'll give it back to the mother," and now God's blessing her because she's actually going to get paid for bringing up her own child. How extraordinary. And yet this child's going to grow up in the Pharaoh's household as well.
But wouldn't it take away from the hard work as well?
Take away from the...
Hard work they were busy with.
Yes, yes. But the mother, but the thing is that we would have to understand in this society is that the females' roles would still have been different to the men. So they would still be in these tasks of rearing the children themselves. So unlike today, the roles are more distinct. So it says, when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter and he became her son. When the child became older, so we actually read from that she actually took the child completely and raised this child up to a certain point in time. She's now being paid by the Pharaoh's daughter to raise her own child, and has now got the protection of the Pharaoh because it's the daughter's child. So she named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." So known as Moses, the connection or the understanding is thought that the Egyptian royal family member, he was probably named Thutmose. Okay, so there was this is one of the names that were being used at that time in history, was Thutmose, as we mentioned a couple of times with some of the pharaohs. So Thutmose was actually the name of a god called Thoth, and it was the patron deity of knowledge, secrets, writing and scribes. Okay? If you read the Bible and you understand that God will not put a name of a false god who is a living God in there, we see that the name's not put in there in any other form other than Moses. It's supposition, but it's believed, many believe that the name Moses is short for Thutmoses, okay, connected to the ruler at the time. So as any Egyptian member of a pharaonic family were believed to be an incarnation of one of their gods, the name Thutmose would not be acceptable in the Bible by name, nor would it be perpetuated by the Hebrews. So his name Moses would have avoided the problem, and the name Moses of course means to pull out or to draw out in the Hebrew language. So in all of this we can see God's hand on this situation. So I've got a couple of more pictures here which are all I guess nice representations. These are all done based on the clothing that's known to be worn at the time. So there's the baby Moses being discovered, and then there's the instructions for Moses to be taken care of by his own mother and the sister there with him. So it just gives us a nice visual reality of what it would have looked like at the time. Okay, so we can see God's hand on this situation. For being adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter meant Moses grew up under the protection of the very king who had ordered his death. No Egyptian wet nurse would suckle a Hebrew child, so that would not happen. So being nursed by a Hebrew woman, especially his own mother, Moses grew up knowing his people and the God of Israel. So this is how he would have still known his roots, his people, his customs, his laws. Because he was brought up, the Bible tells us there, he was brought up there for a number of years before he went into the Pharaoh's household. So then there's the legalistic question. The Pharaoh ordered the death of every Hebrew boy. Why don't you think Moses was killed when he found out this was a Hebrew boy? It's in the scripture again. It says, I'll just find it. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So when someone starts to pay an illegal transaction for the care of that child, she's actually paying her to take care of what's now legally her child. She's saying, "You take care of my child and I will pay you." So she's declaring in this statement that there's a form of ownership, that she's saying that this child is actually my child. And so the other thing that they talk about with this is that when they start talking about paying, it silences any form of inquiry about it. You know, there's no challenge to this. The Pharaoh's daughter. It's saying, well, I'm paying for it, so, you know, do what I say. So this public declaration that's said there in public to the others made it clear that the baby was hers, not that of the real mother who she had unknowingly given the baby to nurse. So Pharaoh Amenhotep III, in history, we can find out that he fathered 2 sons. The first was called the Crown Prince, and his name was Thutmose, funnily enough, and he died before his father, so he was short-lived. The second was called Amenhotep IV, who had been prepared for the priesthood by I, the high priest of the rising sun, as he was called, and he ascended the throne in 1551. So Amun, which is the sun god, the local god of Thebes where they lived, was one of several sun gods, but the worship of Amun often caused a power struggle between the priest and the pharaoh. So the pharaohs and the priests didn't always worship the same, because over all the generations they would build the various temples and the various worship the various gods, but then new pharaohs would come along and say, well, we're not worshipping that god anymore. And that's because these high priests had a lot of power. He said, we're now going to worship a different god. So this is all during the time of Amminadab. So just about to wrap up at this point. But we find here an extraordinary thing which is about to connect us in the next lesson to Tutankhamun. Okay? So Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, he actually abandoned polytheistic worship. So in Egypt, up until this point in time, they'd always worshipped multiple gods. This Pharaoh was the first one not to. So in the 5th year of his reign, he focused on what was called the sun god, called Aten. And he elevated this god above, this is how ridiculous, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? He elevated this god above the other gods, right? And he changed his own name to Akhenaten, which means effective for Aten. Okay? So he changed his name. Now, he said about erasing the name of all other gods. So think about it. You're in Egypt, everybody for all these generations, all the pharaohs have been worshipping all these different gods. They go to the temples, they take the sacrifice, they do all the things that they do. And suddenly a new pharaoh comes along and says, right, it's all finished. Right across the land. You won't go to the temple anymore. Your high priest, your jobs, you don't have them anymore. The whole system would have just collapsed. So you can imagine the chaos that actually happened. So this was the time that Moses was born into, and that Amminadab was living, and Nahshon was also born into. So with a long history of polytheism in Egypt, it's been suggested, and this is the pinch point, and this is a suggestion, is that Moses grew up with this young boy Pharaoh. And Moses walked with one God. So there's those who say, oh well, it might have been the influence of Moses. You know, he only worshipped one God, so this guy said, well, I only worship one God too. We can't definitively say that. But the alignment of the conversation is talking about the fact that this Pharaoh and Moses were aligned at that point in history. So we see the connection between the two. This is one of the most challenging things. People have spent many years trying to track the pharaohs in conjunction with the Bible, but we find through all these events that there is actually these ties that connect them all the way through. And so, in the 5th year of his reign, 1 month after he changed his name, he set about building a completely new city for his sun god, and he called it Akhenaten. And it was located almost halfway between Cairo and Thebes, and it's what's known as modern-day Luxor. So he built a city that was separate to other cities. So remember, there's Lower Egypt where the Nile is, and Upper Egypt, because we're back to front because we're going up the river, is lower down towards Sudan. So this is actually away from the delta, quite away, further down the river, and he builds a whole new city. So some of the biblical commenters talk about how there was the actual Hebrew slaves that were used to actually build that city. Okay? So the majority of the city, history tells us, was built in just 2 years with a population of 20,000 people. 2 years. So this is incredible. You think about it in today's terms, I mean, they're not driving excavators and all, this is all done by hand. Extraordinary. 20,000 people. So it needed a large slave labour to make it possible, and this is where the theory about the Israelites came in. But this cannot be so. For coming soon, God will afflict Egypt with a series of plagues, and he will protect his people. And in Exodus 8:22 it says, they only live in the land of Goshen. Okay, so they didn't move anywhere else, they were only living in the land of Goshen. So those big commentators who were saying, oh, they went to build with the new Pharaoh, that's not the case, because if we take the Bible as truth, it says they only lived in the land of Goshen. It says in the Bible that they were building the cities of Ramses and Pithom. Okay, not this particular city. Okay, so I'm going to bring it to a close at that point. So the point of the journey in the Bible that we've come up to is we know that Moses has been brought up in the household. Right? We know that God's hand's obviously on this situation. He's preparing Moses to be the person who's going to take them out. Obviously, he knew his people. Later on, we hear the story about how he killed a man because they were being hard on his own people. So he identified himself as a Hebrew person, and yet he grew up in the Pharaoh's household. So Moses, you can imagine, was being prepared because later on when he was called before the Pharaohs to negotiate the release of his people, he would have had to be someone who knew how to communicate with the Pharaoh. He would have understood what the rituals were, the customs, the manners, all of that sort of stuff in order to have that communication. He would have spoken the language. We also learn, extraordinarily, that the son, which I'm going to speak in the next lesson, the son of this Akhenaten is actually Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun's original name was Tutankhaten, not Amun. And the reason is because of such chaos in the land of Egypt that he reverted the situation to being polytheistic again when he took over because of the chaos that was in the land. The nation was being split into two. So he said, okay, you can all have your gods back. He changed his name from Aten to Amun. This city ceased to exist. It went for 20 years, his dad died, and they just walked away and left it. So that's what happened in history. And they went back to the polytheistic rule. They went back up into the Nile region, and so we find the story of the Bible connects again as they go further forward. Tutankhamun never had successful children. I don't know if you know his story, but he had 2 children, they were both stillborn, a practice which happened often because they were interbred between brothers and sisters, etc.